I will call the roll. Welcome, everybody. I appreciate your spending an hour and a half with us today. And I think we have a packed meeting, so we'll get going. I'm Peg Miller, one of the co-chairs. Unfortunately, Peter Buckley wasn't able to attend today. So is Gwen Backley here? All right. Dr. Urban Brown. Great, welcome. Brenda Kamini. Great, thank you. Peg King, we talked about that. Yeah, hi. Kali Thornlad.
Here.
Great. Christopher McMorrin.
Hey, Christopher's out of town. I'm Margot. I'm Rep Reynolds' legislative aide, and I'm stepping in for him. And my Wi-Fi is not great, so that's why my camera's off.
Okay. Thanks, Margot. Ruby Ramirez. See Ruby here. Rick Ruzicka.
Here.
Julie Seastream. I don't see Julie. Okay. Tennille Wetherell. And Kate Wilcox. All right. So we're missing a few people. Robin and Pamela are our liaisons from the steering team. I know Robin is here.
Gwen joined too.
Oh, great. Thank you. Hi. Hi. Is Pam here? Pam Ferguson? Okay. And then, of course, Beth and her team.
We are here.
Great, great. Well, let's get started. Let me just review quickly some of the goals for today. We're hoping to provide some updates on the current work that Beth and her team at the Center for Coordination of Oregon Home Visiting Services is doing. We'll also build on a shared understanding of current cross-agency work and identify Horizon 2 opportunities. If you remember last meeting, we talked about the 3/4 horizons, and these are opportunities for a way of viewing the home visiting. And we'll also discuss continued development of this committee's work plan for the rest of this year, including agreement on the next steps on aligning home visiting with the various statewide efforts that are taking place. Any questions about all that stuff? Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Beth.
All right, thanks, Peg. And we just got our slides caught up with your presentation. So, and here's Kate, it looks like. All right, welcome everyone, and thanks again for coming to the meeting. I just want to share a few updates with you all, and hopefully you've been getting some of our communications via email. Most exciting, I want to share, of course, we have our new name. We are COVES, the Center for Coordinating Oregon Home Visiting Systems. And we now have a website that I'm going to just give us a really quick tour of, and this is all thanks to our fabulous team member, Kristen. Can everyone see the website? Yeah, great. So if you haven't taken a look, this is something that it's still very much in development, but we're excited to be putting it together and having it as a platform that we can use to share information both about what the systems work that we're doing is about, as well as information about home visiting. So I'll just give you a quick peek and then you all can check it out yourselves, but you can see we have some resources already and updates from things that have happened, including a workforce study brief that just came out, looking at pay equity for home visitors, links to the Early Learning Council meeting in March, which featured home visiting, links to the OPEC conference where we did a presentation. There's information here about Oregon's home visiting programs. So here we have actually both a link to the early learning map of Oregon, which eventually we're hoping to use to map out where our programs are across the state and what programs are where. And then we have active links to all of our state-funded programs. So you can see those. We're still working to get some there, as well as trying to work on our phase 2, which will be to add additional programs here. This has an active link as well, where people can tell us that their program isn't on here. So this is a way that we can get folks to provide input into the website about what programs are out there that need to be included. So we're excited about that as a platform for sharing information about various programs. There's information about Coves and about our story, the vision, the links to the Early Learning Council and Raise Up Oregon, as well as our 4 Horizons framework that we're using. Then there's information about us and about the advisory groups. So that's just a quick tour of what's in there. And we've gotten some input from the collaborative, as well as from other advisory groups around other things that we might be putting in there at some point. Like we've heard, oh, it'd be great if we could post job announcements, or if we could have more information about things our programs are doing. So lots of ideas there. All right. I went back to the slides. Can everyone see the slides? Okay, good. So that's the update to the website. If you have ideas or things you want to add or tell us about that you think should be on there, please do let us know. We are a sponge for all the information that's out there right now. I also just wanted to give you a quick heads up about a couple of things that are in progress right now for our team. First is what we're calling the Home Visiting Program Information Matrix. We finished the phase 1 of this, which is to map out service eligibility criteria, descriptions of services and locations, as well as other information for our major state models. Our second phase, which we've started to interview culturally specific organizations so that we can start to feature those programs on the website, as well as in information that we're compiling about home visiting, because one of the things that we know is a big system problem that we need to untangle is how to create more coordinated information about what home visiting programs are out there and available in different communities. So this is our first sort of phase of work in terms of creating that sort of compilation of information about home visiting programs.
There's a question in the chat, sorry, from Brenda, about we want people to actively promote programs signing up to be listed.
You're sorry, you broke up a little bit for me. Could you say the question again, Rebecca?
Apologies. Brenda asked whether we want to actively promote programs signing up to be listed on the website.
If we'll be actively promoting them, I'm not sure what you mean by that, but we would love to feature more programs. So, right, our phase 1 is for us to do work to get culturally specific programs information up here. Our next phase is regional programs. So Brenda, I know you've got a lot in your community and we'd love to have more. Kali has a question also.
Yes, there are programs that are bilingual, but not necessarily culturally specific. And I'm wondering if you're illuminating the bilingual programs within the larger programs. We heard a lot about that actually when we were visiting Central Oregon, and the need for bilingual families to know what programs speak their language. Or have workers that speak their language.
Yeah, that's a great piece of information that I think we should think about including. Because right now it's really not meant to be family facing yet, but that's like our next phase. So ideas like that are perfect. Do you have bilingual staff? Do you have Spanish speaking staff? Or staff who speak other languages for that matter? Any other quick questions or thoughts? We're going to have some conversation and continue to work on, once we compile this information, what are the best ways to get it out there and communicate about it and make it useful to folks. So that's something that we'll be coming back to with this team as well as with our steering team. The final thing I want to update folks on are we have an ad hoc funding and advocacy work group that's really doing some strategic thinking about making sure we have a sustainability plan, not just for Coves and the Coves work, but as well as in making sure that we can start to build out regional home visiting coordination and what that might look like. So if you're interested in being on the funding and advocacy ad hoc work group, please do let us know. We're just getting started and starting to plan so that we can really be intentional about creating opportunities and using opportunities that come up to expand that infrastructure piece that we know is so important. Trying to advance my screen always gets frozen if I don't advance it for a minute. Okay. Whoops. All right, I want to share just a couple more things. Whoops, let me go back a second. So today we're going to have an opportunity to do some work to really hear about and think about together how we do more connection across various systems that touch or could more intentionally involve home visiting. Part of that work on our team is starting with just a crosswalk of some of these regional home visiting system activities that we know are happening. So I just want to show you what we've got so far. This is helping us and our staff who are working right now to start to do what we're calling an opportunity or asset map. So what we're trying to identify are places and regions across the state where we know there's some intentional investments in things that are working on coordinating services for early childhood services for families. So we have a number of things that we've identified as happening across the state, such as our McVie funds, which support system work, the Ford Family Investments, Family Connects Oregon, which we know has a community alignment component, as well as work being done by ODHS to move services upstream, OPEC and OHEC, which is a new initiative coming out of the Oregon Health and Education Collaborative. So these are just things that are happening across the state. And then what we've done is to try to identify where they're happening and then start by interviewing and trying to learn more within each of these regions, especially and starting with the priority areas where we know that there's a lot going on, right? So we're really trying, Rebecca and Kristen and Ron and Callie are all in the process right now of talking to hub directors, community alignment specialists, our LPHAs and other key partners in those communities to learn about what's working for them in terms of coordinating with home visiting. What are the barriers that they're encountering and what might be the role for either our team or the state or other regional work to break down those barriers. So that's the learning part. And then we hope to use that information to support our work moving forward, as well as to bring that information to this committee and to other key partners who can really look at, well, what are we doing at the state level to support that regional success and regional implementation? So that's some of the work that we're doing right now to sort of reach out and better understand all these different efforts that are happening across different agencies and with different sources of support and with different kinds of foci, as we move forward to do this opportunity map for home visiting for Oregon. We're going to have two opportunities today to learn a little bit more about some of the work that's happening and that's been coming up in a variety of contexts and conversations. First, we're going to hear about the work that's happening around the social emotional health metric, which is being developed to incentivize CCOs to promote access to social emotional learning services for early families with young children. So the Children's Institute, Kali and Dana, are going to share what they have been doing around the social emotional health metric. And then we'll have an opportunity as a group after that presentation to talk about where are there opportunities for home visiting to be connected to this work? Are there opportunities? We know that home visiting services provide access to social emotional supports through the direct work that they do, as well as screening. So we'll learn a little bit more about that and talk about within this committee where there might be other opportunities as that work rolls out across the state. And then after that, we're going to hear from Jennifer Holman from ODHS. Jennifer will be talking about the ODHS Vision for Transformation and their work to move their services upstream into the prevention world, and how we can better partner with them to make sure that home visiting is a robust part of that family preservation system. And she's also going to talk about a few pilots that are being funded by the Doris Duke Foundation that's looking at how to coordinate services for families screened out at the point of being called having a call into the hotline. So then we'll talk about how that relates to home visiting and where we might strengthen some of those connections. Okay. Any questions before I move on? I'm going to turn it over to Kali and Dana to get us started. And I can.
Okay, just jumping in. Well, thank you all. I am excited to, do a quick overview of the work that CI has done on this, and I've invited Dana, who was here during this time. I was not. Who, if you have questions, would be the person to ask around, what took place and how this work sort of developed to be what it is. At a very high level, this was our vision, purpose, and activities. And the metric is very wonky, so I wanted to share just some quotes from families about what the metric does, because it's great to have things on paper, but there was a reason that we designed this metric the way we did. One parent, and we listened to many families, and that is how we got to this point. One parent said, "The journey to find services for my son has felt like finding a needle in a haystack. We have a behavioral health coordinator through our CCO, and they told us there are no services available. Saying I felt helpless is an understatement. Now that my son is 10, we are paying the price for not having services he needed when he was younger. I truly believe this metric will help families like ours." Another quote, "Our adopted son is among thousands of kids in Oregon who need behavioral health supports. We faced tremendous challenges getting him help he needed. Long wait times, no available services, no help finding supports. We waited for an autism evaluation for over a year, and I constantly heard that he was too young to get care, and that lack of care will affect him and our family for the rest of our lives." Those are some voices behind why we have the social emotional metric and why this is so important for children in our state. Next slide. Can I change the slide? Because I don't know how to. Okay. This gives you an overview of the implementation journey. We had a technical work group that met 10 times in 2018 and included centering family voice in the decision. So those voices that you had a little glimpse of, we listened to just shy of 187, I think, parents and caregivers who shared their voice with us. We intentionally reached out to diverse stakeholders and diverse families, bilingual families, so that we can know those who are furthest from opportunity, what did they need. The work group was comprised of 22 people that included advocates, pediatricians, community health leaders, and CCO representatives. So this wasn't done in a vacuum, but really included people who are in the field doing the work. Next slide. And I think this summarizes, I'm not going to read the slide for you, but this were some of the big things that we found. And part of this came from, what do you need to be ready for kindergarten? That was a question that was asked. What do families feel like their children need to be ready for kindergarten? And so readiness meant having children with strong social emotional skills, having children with strong executive function skills, helping children to be familiar with school and understand classroom and school routines. So there was a recognition of the fact that we didn't have enough services and supports, but there was also this thoughtfulness about how do we ensure, not only do we support kids, but that we ensure that our children are going to be able to thrive once they hit kindergarten. And so this were some of the things that rose to the top. And I guess I would say on this slide, we know that the metric and CCOs alone can't address the comprehensive need for social emotional services, but we do believe this is one piece of the puzzle that is designed to fill gaps in the system. And so it was thoughtfully designed, as I said, with community voices in mind, with practitioners at the table to be part of the solution so that our state can do a better job supporting our youngest children when they most need it. And when, as many of you heard me say, 90% of their brain is being developed. Over to Dana.
Thanks, Kali. So I'll get into a little bit more of that technical detail of what the metric actually is. For the past 3 years, CCOs are not being held accountable to providing more social emotional health services to children and their families. They've actually been held accountable to and received their incentive dollars for doing planning to do that. And that has had 4 required components. First, they've had to look at their data. How many kids who are their members have been billing for any social emotional health service? Look at who is in their provider network, who is providing social emotional health services in their regions. Are they providing them to 0 to 5-year-olds? What languages are they in? What cultural groups are they well serving, et cetera? They've taken that data to community stakeholders and then using it to like check the data in the map. Did we get it right? Do you have improvements? Are there additions? Is this not actually true? And then using the data, the map, and the community engagement to inform a plan for what actions they can take to tee them up to serve more children as the child level metric kicks in next year. Next slide. So in terms of the data statewide, this is what we found. Only 5% of children are receiving any social emotional health service. And that includes children who received a screening. So if you actually look at the service end, it's going to be less than that 5%. And this seems low, given that anytime you talk to someone who works with young children and families directly, like home visitors, preschool teachers, childcare providers, et cetera, what we often hear is they see a kind of social emotional health crisis facing children. So gut is that this is too low. Next slide. So when you look at what some CCOs are doing to take action to actually expand access to services, here's some examples. It's not totally comprehensive, but those examples include working through some of the complications of establishing Medicaid billing capacity in community organizations who might be well designed to serve communities needing support. And I think HealthShare, you'll hear from Peg, is probably the leader in this arena. Not many CCOs have gotten here, but this is a great potential strategy, but a lot of really hard work. 2 is improving those referral pathways. So I think plenty of the CCOs maybe weren't familiar with like what home visiting was out there and happening in that space, what parenting education was available, where they could even send families if they were noticing these things in the clinic. And so a lot of CCOs are just building those referral networks, improving that outreach and communication, and then buying into some kind of technology tool and human capacity to make sure those referrals to other services are closed loop referrals. Like, do we know that families have actually gotten connected to a service that they need? And then finally, taking your behavioral health providers and seeing if we can bolster their skill set around serving young children in particular in a 2-generation approach. So some folks might say, hey, we're a children's behavioral health provider, but maybe they only serve kids older than 12 or older than 5. Can we take that provider network and get them to stretch down? And I think next is Peg.
Do we leave room for questions, Beth, or do you want to just go into the next one? You're on mute.
Let's go ahead and go to Peg and then we'll have discussion at the end, if that's okay.
Okay, and I think you can start at slide 5 of my deck because they covered a lot of stuff that I was going to cover. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we have done at HealthShare with this metric. You can go to the next. Yeah, okay, so this is just quickly our data over time. As Dana mentioned, it's a very low reach rate. It's, it started out in 21 with like 4% of our members. I also have Trillium, which is the other CCO in our region up there. We're doing a joint presentation, so I just stole the slides from that. And we've kind of doubled it over 2 years, but even now 8% of kids is very low for getting any kind of social emotional health service. Next slide. This is just another way of looking at that, the reach rate over time. So, and then the question is always like, well, how many kids should be getting this? And according to the AAP, 100% of kids should be screened at every well visit in the first 5 years of life, which is not really happening. But screening is really not the focus of this metric. It's brief intervention and therapeutic services. National data says that between 12 and 17% of kids 1 to 5 will have a diagnosis that would benefit from services. And we know, looking at our own social complexity data that we have, that over 25% of our 0 to 5-year-olds have 3 or more like ACEs or social complexity factors that would most likely benefit from services. Next slide. So we've hosted, like Dana said, we've done a lot of data analysis, asset mapping, and then we've had many community conversations. We have another one coming up July 24th at the Kennedy School. But hearing from the community, once sort of presenting our data and our asset maps, and then getting input from them, like what should the CCOs be doing differently to better serve our youngest members. And a lot of stuff, this is similar to Dana, I won't go through this, but like workforce development, navigation, referral pathways. So we took all of that and we have to come up with an action plan every year. So next slide, we came up with we had a clinical level strategy investments and community level investments. And our board has approved about $3 million over the 2 years to do this work. So we're doing a lot of training of both the specialty behavioral health as well as integrated in primary care and of primary care providers themselves, of like just how to work with this age group. Because what we found is a lot of people don't want to or don't know or don't feel like they have the skills to serve this age group. We're also funding 10 or 12 scholarships and stipends to place interns into like Morrison, for example, to learn how to serve these 0 to 5-year-olds. And a big focus of that is intended to diversify the workforce serving these families. And then on the community side, we've been funding IRCO, the Immigrant Refugee Community Organization, as well as Adelante Mujeres, to hire community health workers to work with these families and to explore billing Medicaid for services. Because like Dana said, this is moving towards a child level metric next year. So it'll just be claims data. So I think there's about 17 claims that will count towards this metric. And we're also working on a regional messaging campaign right now to sort of destigmatize accessing mental health for young kids. Next slide. I won't talk about this. This is just what's coming next year, which is that it'll move from the child level metric. And we've been talking back to the home visiting piece. Home visiting, I work very closely with the 3 counties in our region. And the question is like, could they be billing Medicaid for some of these services? Right now they're billing targeted case management, but that is not going to count for this metric. So I've been talking a lot to the Washington County folks about how can we potentially fund a pilot there that would see about how home visitors could fit more into this metric, because right now it doesn't really fit in, or it hasn't. So I'll just stop there because I know we don't have a lot of time, but happy to take questions or ideas, comments.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Peg. So we wanted to, at this point, have a little pause before we go to the next presentation so that we can talk a little bit more about the social emotional metric and what questions folks might have about the metric. And then we're going to ask for thoughts about, what does this mean for you in your agency and your partners and your programs? And how might you be connecting in your work to the social emotional metric or the CCO work that's happening in your region. So I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen for a minute so we can see each other better. And Rebecca, maybe you could put the questions in the chat for us.
Sure, just 1 second.
Folks have questions about the social emotional metric?
I do. Thanks. Thanks for that. I was just looking at the slide, seeing if I could answer my own question. But when it moves to the child level, like what actually will count as kind of like a mark, like for like a child receiving services a certain, like I know we're talking about like potentially home visiting services being kind of, but like is there a certain like dose duration or anything like that, or is it more still like a self-attestate? Like I'm just kind of curious if that's been determined.
There's a draft measure specifications out.
Okay.
The metrics and scoring committee next month will finalize this, but home visiting is not one of they're CPT claims, and it's things like education and training for patient self-management by qualified non-physician, individual psychotherapy, family psychotherapy, group psychotherapy, health behavior intervention. So there's 17 of them on the draft list right now.
And they're both, Gwen, it's a mix of short-term, like lighter touch interventions done by behavioral health providers, and longer-term, like a parent-child interaction therapy or parent-child, that would be like a more weeks of service over time. So it's inclusive of a variety of strategies in the healthcare system related to what that healthcare provider sees as the need. I was going to say one more thing. If I think of it, I'll pop off mute.
Well, it's not just medical providers. It's like what we're trying to figure out is community health workers.
Community, right? Okay.
As well, like which of these codes would they be able to bill under the supervision of a clinician? Like the education and training for patient self-management, I think, is one we've identified as that could be a CHW potentially billing Medicaid.
Thank you.
But setting up that Medicaid, that infrastructure so that people can bill like fee for service Medicaid so that it can get counted.
We did have quite a conversation in our region, though, as the community partners came together to help kind of do planning around this work, that there's a clear divide in the paraprofessional programming and the services they're already coming alongside to provide parents, and what's being done on the medical side, and that hasn't been bridged because of the billing issue. And so that's generated a ton of conversation.
I've been trying to sort of respond a little bit to Robin's questions about, home visiting, and it really is, how do you capture that in your claims data? Because it is through claims data, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so not all home visiting uses bills, and so it's how do we then enter that into some sort of a claims situation, which is what you're trying to move towards. It's like reimburse any home visitor for that work. I hope that helps, Robin.
Dr. Brown, you had a question.
I do, and I'm not going to take up a lot of time because I see my colleague Jennifer is already logged in and ready to go. So I appreciate you sharing that particular slide, but I think I'm still in shock just looking at how low that number is. And so I guess my question is, I know we're all trying to, move in the right direction to get all of our kids taken care of and get all of our families serviced. But I guess, is anyone else kind of a little bit shocked or overwhelmed that our numbers are so low when it comes to just, not enough of our kids are getting, SEL? I mean, maybe I'm just the only one who's still just like in shock when I see this.
Shock, I think, is a very fair, justified reaction to this number. And, I think some of the data that was even more shocking is if you look at subpopulations of children by risk factor, like if you only look at children in foster care, then you jump to 15, 20% of kids have received even a screening, let alone a service. If you look at children with an incarcerated parent, also, the numbers are shocking, numbers where you would say close to 100% of children with an incarcerated parent should be receiving a social emotional health long-term service.
Yes.
That is absolutely not 100% not happening.
Wow.
But this is why the metric is so important, and it's why I think this group is getting educated on it, because we're not where we need to be. As Peg showed, even though they've doubled the percent is still low. And so it is really important that there is some awareness, and I think maybe pressure on the system to support more young children and to finance and the investment so they can do so and ensure the reimbursement rates are fair.
Yes, and I think on your last presentation during the ELC, I was listening intently to you, Ms. Ladd, in regards to just our numbers, and when you throw in race and the intersectionality of parents are incarcerated, I was listening, I was queuing in. I wasn't you didn't see my face because I'm behind the scenes during the ELC meetings, but I'm always listening because we talk a lot about trying to center equity, and sometimes I think we intentionally use equity because we don't say what we really mean. And so that, I think, sometimes we just have to unpack. And so when I see this, it just reminds me that, hey, we got a lot of work to do. I know we're doing good work, but when I see this, it's like we still got a long way to go if we're trying to make some changes systemically. So.
And I totally agree. And to Kali's point, I can attest to how much this metric is driving conversation and funding at the CCO level. It's a game changer. When I've been at HealthShare for 8 years, no one was talking about 0 to 5-year-olds. They're talking about, the people that cost the system the most money. So this metric has had a profound change in what we're talking about at HealthShare, what we're funding at HealthShare. So I think it was designed to make the CCOs do more, and I think it's working from where I sit.
Robin, I saw you had some comments in the chat. Do you want to maybe share them with the group about screening? It was about screening and assessment.
Thank you, Beth. I don't want to take up time. I know there's more presentations. I was just also making the connection between home visiting. The field itself sees so many families. The more we coordinate home visiting, the more families we're able to bring into home visiting, and home visiting is a field that sees families on a regular basis. The families who aren't in home visiting are the ones who are less likely to get referred to behavioral health services. And if that mechanism of screening is happening in home visiting, it's just such a great opportunity for us to unlock the assets of home visiting and the metric. And maybe it's part of this group. And I think, Peg, you're doing a phenomenal job of describing it happening in HealthShare, as far as knowing all those components of the flow of referrals. Anyway, so I don't know if that helps. I'm trying not to use talking time, but I'm so glad we're having this conversation. It's so important. Is there anything I said that wasn't clear? Or probably everything. Is there anything I said that there's a question about?
No, and we have time. We built in ample time for this conversation because that's really why we're here. So, and thanks. That's kind of what I was thinking, Robin, too. And I was wondering, that is where home visiting can play this role and facilitate more pressure on the CCOs to find those services. And And I guess Peg, it looks like from what you put up there, what I'm hearing is the two kind of biggest barriers in terms of getting more families to service are that, number one, the services aren't there for the young ones, right? There's still a huge gap in that workforce for 0 to 5 in behavioral health. Is that one?
I mean,
message?
there are services. It's not that there are no services. There needs to be like a much more diverse culturally and linguistically workforce. And then people need more training, which we're doing a whole learning collaborative for specialty providers, integrated behavioral health, and also for primary care. So there are services, but they're just not enough. And I think that part of the stigma, people are like, oh, that kid's 2, he'll grow out of it. Like, so part of this campaign we're working on that'll roll out in the winter is like, how do we address that? Like, get kids to services much earlier.
Well,
So
and
multi-level, I'd say.
I remember the thing, Gwen, I was going to say earlier to your question, some of these billing codes require a child to have a diagnosis in order to use that billing code. And some of the billing codes don't require any diagnosis. So that's one more reason, especially with the 0 to 5 population, to have the whole range of billing codes that can be counted as service. Because as you know, sometimes it's very inappropriate to be diagnosing such a young child. To Peg's point, like, we don't know exactly why a kid is exhibiting XYZ kind of behavior, but we know support would help, and we don't want to tack a label on a child if it's not appropriate and useful. And so this kind of approach gives the healthcare system the flexibility while still fitting in the regulatory structure of Medicaid.
Thanks, Tina.
Peg.
I think we need to bring up that not only is there a paucity of services, and I agree with Peg King, there are some services available, but in rural areas, it is really a desert for services. So even if, and I think Kali's quotes were really meaningful, particularly to me, because I've seen families that struggle with that very same thing, even with someone trying to navigate to help them find those services.
I'm curious, Peg or anyone else, whether the CCOs refer, or if any of the, to relief nurseries at all for early childhood behavioral health services, because I know some of them do have clinicians.
That is a good question. I mean, as I've talked about before, that we've invested in Help Me Grow as like a centralized, so we would direct families to Help Me Grow, who would have the menu of services and supports, whether it's parenting classes, home visiting, relief nurseries, but not directly, I would say. We're trying to use that as a kind of a funnel.
There's also the question of the second barrier. The second big barrier that I heard you talk about was capacity for billing. Like, do these community-based organizations, can they do billing? Or are there ways that, is there any kind of state backbone to help community-based organizations do the billing part? I don't know.
Well, this actually just came up, a word of a culturally specific word that you probably know. And they are going to start doing billing so they can be able to offer more services that are Afrocentric, but it's like a year and a half, like the amount of time it's going to take for OHA to certify them is like ridiculously long. And I know that the reason for doing it is we heard a lot of what Diana said, families, there's stigma around it. Kids, particularly in the African-American community, I can't speak for all communities, nor can I speak for the whole Black community, but we heard over and over again, fear of labels, because Black kids are already labeled once they get into school. And then a history of being tested on and all, these terrible things. And so culturally specific, I think organizations are critical because they are seen as trusted people. So if they're able to certify, they should be allowed to, but the process, the fact that it takes so long, when I think about what happens within the course of a year, that a child doesn't have services, it's pretty terrible. And there was a question of like, why? why does it take so long? No one could really answer. They're like, oh, it's OHA, but it shouldn't take that long. And I think this is a larger organization. For smaller community organizations, it's going to be even tougher. So I do think those administrative things are not insignificant in terms of increasing access. And yeah, I had the conversation last night, so it's fresh.
The other thing we heard from like Adelante was at a social emotional health summit that we co-hosted in March. And, one of the things they talked about was like when you're utilizing Medicaid billing to provide your service, to balance your books, you kind of need to have a client 9 to 10, 10 to 11, 11 to 12, maybe take a lunch break, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5 in order to pay your bills. And that model is hard to be sustainable, both in terms of like making sure appointments are limited to 1 hour or 50 minutes really, and not having that flexibility to go for an hour and a half if that's what's called for in this situation, not having the ability for the practitioners to take breaks to rejuvenate themselves is a really hard model to sustain from a kind of workforce and family service perspective. And so I know community organizations are thinking about how to utilize Medicaid billing, but maybe supplement it with other funding streams to allow them to build a service delivery model that's better suited for their clients and their workforce.
Brenda, I saw your comment in the chat, and I was wondering, so Brenda said, mapping home visiting programs with infant mental health credentialed staff. So folks who have that infant mental health certification would be a great contribution to readiness to bridge billing for service. Could you say a little bit more about that, Brenda? Because I think that's a really interesting idea.
Well, we're just having the conversation, particularly in line with resources around suspension, expulsion as well. So all of these things connect, but really about how to build the capacity for that, and out in more rural areas, having the ability to have the reflective supervision and qualified folks to help make that happen is something we're kind of trying to take a look at. But that was one of the questions that our community partners brought up. Healthy Families, Relief Nursery, Early Head Start. We've really pushed over the last couple years, helping them build their capacity in that credentialing world. And yet they still aren't in a place where it can bill for service. Mm-hmm. And so our CCO conversations have been, but that needs to be picked up by a qualified mental health, behavioral health person. And we're in that same boat. We've mapped what's available with emphasis in training for young children, and it's scarce. So right. looking for alternatives and building broad capacity.
All right. Thank you for that. Yeah. One last comment, Kali, and then I do want to turn to Jennifer so we can hear from our ODHS partners about some of their upstream work that's happening.
My comment has a question for Sue Miller, because of her role on the council as chair, and just the fact that behavioral health is getting so much attention because it's the governor's priority. I'm wondering if the council is looking at how to elevate the behavioral health needs of young children and, support some of the things that are coming up in this conversation.
Thanks, Kelly. Good to see you. I wish you were still on the council. I'll just put that in as an aside. And Peg Miller, who's on the council as well as co-chairing this committee, is going to be testifying actually at the Screening and Metrics Committee, is that the name? Screening
Metrics and Scoring.
Thank you. Metrics and Scoring Committee a week from tomorrow on behalf of the council and obviously in support of the metric. As the council continues to focus on the suspension expulsion prevention program, the development of that, obviously social emotional support is a core to that. So we will certainly be staying connected to this conversation, at least through SEP, if not in a broader context. And we're going to have a SEP update on every council agenda. Subin O is on the council and co-chairs the SEP advisory committee now. So Subin will be presenting an update at every council meeting.
Great.
Thanks for the question, Kelly. Good to see
All
you.
right. Thank you, Sue. Thank you, everyone. I want to pause now and introduce everyone to Jennifer Holman from ODHS. And actually, Jennifer, I'm going to let you introduce yourself to the group. And then do you have slides you want to share?
I do.
Okay.
Yes, but I can share them. That's fine.
Okay, great. I will just
Yep.
turn it over to you then.
Great.
Welcome.
Thank you, Beth. Thanks for having me, everyone. And I recognize several of you from other conversations and other spaces. So good to see your faces again. I'm Jennifer Holman. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Family Preservation Manager for Child Welfare and Self-Sufficiency at the Department of Human Services. So coming here to spend some time with you today to quickly kind of review the visions that are in place in the agency, and then really looking at those around prevention and preservation. Wanted to share two distinct sort of pieces of work that are happening. One is the Doris Duke Foundation work with our agency, and then also talking just briefly about the family preservation work that's happening, and then hope to have a great discussion with you all about your thoughts about that. And I'm already, as I was listening to this previous conversation, wow, there's so much alignment and just thinking about different areas and just these things I'm going to talk about today where we may be able to join together. So I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. You all seeing my screen? Okay. All right. Make you all a little bit bigger. There we go. Okay, so first I wanted to just start by looking at kind of the foundation of this work for our agency around child welfare and self-sufficiency. So everything I'm going to talk with you about today is across both of those programs. So my position is across both of those programs, and that's kind of the direction also that we're heading as an agency, is really looking at how we come together, particularly child welfare and self-sufficiency, to share resources, contracting, supports to really to work with families, both around economic and concrete supports, safety, and all the different ways that we can support families together. So the work that we're doing is based in two visions, which are absolutely aligned with each other. So self-sufficiency is working around their vision into action. And one of the foundations, or kind of the opening statement on that vision, is believing that everyone in Oregon deserves opportunities to thrive and reach their full potential. So maximizing potential to really help entire communities in our state thrive. And that aligns with the child welfare vision for transformation, where child welfare is really looking at their work focused around believing that children do best growing up in their families and communities, and that we do that work best by honoring and supporting the cultural wisdom of communities, building community resilience, and in particular, the determination of communities of color. And so these two visions really align with each other. So all the work that we are pursuing now across both programs must be able to demonstrate how we align with these two visions. So I'm hoping, as you know, I move through this, that you're going to see that value set in there. So what I wanted to share with you today is, and I don't know how to make this thing go away. Sorry, that thing at the top there that's blocking a little bit of this. But this is a diagram from Chapin Hall out of the University of Chicago, and they recently released their multi-system framework for child and family well-being. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend the document. This is one of the visuals that they use in that document, and I'm bringing it to you today because I think it's a multi-system approach. So on a larger kind of macro level, this is the work that ODHS also intends to be doing and strives towards. So, and a lot of the things that you all were just talking about in your previous conversation just fit so nicely into this framework. So we as an agency are looking at all of these areas. Strategic service expansion, you're going to hear me talk about that a little bit with family preservation today. Eligibility expansion, right? Looking at how do we expand eligibility so that more folks have access when they need it. And that goes right into enhancing accessibility. And like you were just talking about, reducing administrative barriers and red tape for families. These right side kind of three, family-centered practice, community-centric delivery, and narrowing the child protective response are really three key areas that we are focusing on at the moment. Particularly, you're going to hear me talk about family preservation and the Doris Duke Foundation work. So really looking at how do we build our workforce skills around centering families and around getting really good at the very narrow piece of work, particularly that child welfare is charged with doing, and moving away from kind of this very broad definition. Community-centric delivery, so all the efforts that we're moving forward are really brought to us by communities and folks in communities. So really asking that question of why are we doing this? Who said this was a need? How do we know this is a need? And then really narrowing that child protective response. So only intervening when absolutely necessary. And again, that comes with sort of understanding the true sort of purpose of child welfare in 2024. So stemming from that, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about two of those initiatives. So family preservation will be the first one. That's the body of work that I manage out of ODHS. And so this is really the approach that we're looking at instilling in the agency that's actualizing those two visions that I just talked about. And the way that we're hoping to do that is by sort of shifting our priorities around keeping families and community families together and in their communities. So really looking at what would it take to keep families together while ensuring safety and stability rather than separating them for the purposes of foster care. So obviously right now, particularly child welfare is known as a foster care agency. Most of the families that are served in child welfare are served in foster care. So the hope is to really offset that. And of those families that we must intervene with, that we're serving those families together. And that communities and families are telling us what they need, when they need it, how they need it, and who they need it from. And that's the system that we have. So this work is really based on 4 foundational elements that are all seated in data and equity. So really looking at being very data based in our decision making, and also looking at everything that we're doing, including our data disaggregated by race, really looking at a targeted universalism approach. So rather than saying what will help everyone, we're saying what will help specific populations who are overrepresented and underserved in our system. Because when we can figure that out, that's going to eventually help everyone. What we know is when we put a strategy in place that we're saying this is going to help everyone, it doesn't help everyone. That's what we've been doing for the last 100 years. And here we are. So really looking at these 4 foundational elements, the first one being intra-agency relationships, and that's child welfare and self-sufficiency specific right now. So how do we come together and do this work? In family preservation, when we have a family that we're working with in their home, child welfare and self-sufficiency co-case manage that case. So we have self-sufficiency, family coach and a caseworker, both managing the case together. With families, we have leadership from both programs working together. We have combined contracting that's being put in place and combined resource usage. So I'm really looking at moving that forward. We're focusing on practice. So getting our child welfare folks really good at identifying when we do and don't have a safety threat. And when we do identify a safety threat, that we're really, really skilled at identifying, can we manage safety in the home with kids and families together? So really focusing on practice. And for self-sufficiency, that's looking at multi-generational work. So not just focusing on the one eligible adult in the family, but recognizing that that adult comes with a family attached to it with multi-generations. And then community engagement. So that's really a huge piece of this, is looking at each individual community and what their needs are, and working with those communities to develop ways to meet those needs or strengthen what's already in place, with things like looking at eligibility criteria, saying, well, if you can bill, like you were just talking about, for this piece of work, but not for this piece, but you think this piece over here is going to be key, we'll pay for that, and then you bill for that. And so how do we look at combined funding? Also, how do we engage our communities? So we are saying what is needed, and that's what we're hoping to work towards. Supports and services is really about those sustainable community partnerships and local innovations. So really, we're trying to build an overarching structure based on these foundational elements that then within that structure has flexibility for specific communities. So moving away again from that idea is we've figured out the thing and everybody's going to do it the same way around the state, because we know that doesn't work. So that's really the family preservation work that we're doing. We are demonstrating that right now. So we are trying lots of different things in different areas of the state. So we have our first cohort. I'm not sure why Klamath is highlighted on there, so we'll just ignore that. We love Klamath. But our first cohort was Alberta, the Alberta branch in Multnomah County, the Douglas branch in Roseburg and Klamath County. They started about 2 years ago with this work. And then we brought on cohort 2 about a year ago. And you'll see where cohort 2 is located. In 2025, we'll be selecting cohort 3 to begin this work as well. So it really is a reprioritization on keeping kids and families together and creating stability. Within family preservation, y'all, there's a ton of innovations that at some point I would love to talk to you about, but this is kind of the piece of work that's holding them all in there. The other thing I know folks were interested in is the Doris Duke Foundation work that ODHS is engaging in. So really that work is focused on our closed screening calls. So it's when a call comes into the hotline, and there's a decision made that this call doesn't rise to the level of needing to be assigned to a child welfare branch for investigation. And so we close those calls at screening. Those are a majority of the calls that come into the hotline are closed at screening. Lots of folks in the community think, oh, I need to call the hotline because this family needs something. And if I call the hotline, they will get what they need. And that's not the case a majority of the time, because when those closed at screening calls happen, that's really where it ends for ODHS. So what we're exploring with Doris Duke is looking at how do we take those closed at screenings in 2 distinct pathways. This work was happening on a very small scale already in Oregon. So Doris Duke is coming in with technical assistance to support understanding how these do or don't work for families and what capacity would be needed to grow them. So one of those pathways, which is being worked on in Portland, is reporters call the hotline, and those closed at screening calls that occur go over to LifeWorks Northwest. And they then work with families on connections to community resources. LifeWorks Northwest is the group that is being worked with because that was already in place on a very small scale. So we want to kind of look at how that's working. The other pathway that we're looking at is in Klamath County, where reporters call the Child Protection Hotline, and those calls that are screened out go to a self-sufficiency family coach. And that family coach reaches out to families to actively, offer support and resources. So we're looking at these two pathways to kind of learn about them and see what it would take to grow them. In particular, if we're looking at a community-based organization, what is key there that families are saying is helpful and works, and how would we grow capacity to other organizations to be helping these families? So that's a big part of this work. I'm going to put up another slide here, which is going to be super overwhelming, and I apologize about that. But a third part of this work you're going to see is we have flexible funding. It's right down here along the bottom. So the Doris Duke Foundation is also bringing with them $3 million around direct cash to families for this initiative. And that does not come through ODHS. It will go through a community-based organization to be dispersed to families. We have an advisory group that's made up of people who have experienced these systems and some community partners and tribal folks to decide where this money is going, how it's getting to families, and what that whole system will look like. So that those decisions are being made by folks in these communities who have experienced these systems. So you'll see we have a lot of folks coming to join us in that work. We have the Harvard Kennedy School of Government Performance Lab, Foster America, Think of Us, Chapin Hall is evaluating it. So lots of partners in there for the next 3 years. I'm happy to answer more questions about that. But that really is trying to see if we can get a little bit further upstream, still some contact with child welfare through the hotline, but really how can we meet needs further upstream? So I wanted to also share one other graphic and then I'll end. This is a graphic that is still in the works. So we know this is not a perfect graphic, but when we take that larger Chapin Hall sort of arch and look at that macro level, then trying to really look at this arch is a little bit tighter in, and particularly looking at self-sufficiency and when families become involved in the child welfare, experience child welfare in some way, and how these initiatives fit in there. So if we're looking at kind of the prevention space, this is really where self-sufficiency lives in terms of, how we can get supports and services to families prior to any sort of involvement with child welfare. Then we have a call to the hotline that results hopefully in the Doris Duke realm around resource connection for families that have a closed-it screening. Then if there is a safety threat identified with a family, and we want to be able to serve that family in home, this is where family preservation comes in its current phase. This will expand, but that's a whole nother story. And hoping to avoid this area of the arch that is really an intervention part of our work. So the last thing I'll show is when we're looking at these different areas in prevention, preservation, and intervention, just trying to help folks understand what may be present in these areas. A lot of folks don't quite get it until you can show. So seeing, right, home visiting as a prevention area of work, as well as a preservation area of work. So really looking at, both of these places of work and different ways that we can support families. So trying to demonstrate that. And then I know there were specific questions that were going to be asked. So that was a ton of information really quickly. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. See if there are first questions about anything that I just said. And then move into Beth. I know you have questions you want folks to discuss.
I just want to say, Jennifer, I want to invite you to my section meeting and have you do this presentation to my team, because this has been the clearest presentation of how it all fits together that I have ever seen. And I also think you should come to RUACT and present that as well. So really, really awesome. Thank you so much.
I appreciate that. And I'm not going to admit to the amount of overthinking I did about this presentation. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Other questions for Jennifer? And yes, I just want to echo my thanks, and hopefully you'll be able to recycle this presentation. Sounds like you have a couple of invitations already.
Happy to, for sure.
So I'm curious, as folks were listening to this, what came up for you in terms of thinking about, well, you know, home visiting and where home visiting sits? And thank you for that last slide, Jennifer, that showed, you know, home visiting is a partner there on the prevention side. But really, you know, I think part of what the goal, one of the goals for having the presentation today is to start to really think more intentionally about how ODHS work and home visiting work and happens, and what the connections are at the state level and at the regional levels. So what was coming up for people?
I have I'll start. Thank you, Jennifer. That was great. And I might ask you to put the slide back up. It was one of the last ones. I felt like I was trying to, like, what are those in prevention, preservation, and intervention, some of the programs, because in my mind, I think, and I could be out of touch with some of this, but I was wondering if home visiting fell into also, and I maybe just didn't see it, was in the preservation area as well, not just in prevention. So I was kind of curious if it was showing up there.
Yeah, is this the slide you're talking about?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, and I would say yes. I mean, I view it in preservation as well.
Okay.
I think part of this is every time we go, we kind of revisit this and think about it. We go, oh, wait, this needs to be here as well, or this needs to be over here. So it's kind of a ever evolving. I mean, obviously these aren't listing, you know, half of what's out there. So yes, I mean, I think absolutely it would be helpful in preservation for sure.
Thanks. Yeah, that's kind of been my experience in working with some of the home visiting programs. It seems like sometimes when families might go through a safety assessment, that connection to some of the home visiting programs was part of sort of that preservation.
Yeah.
Model. Yeah.
And one of the things I think around that is that we talk about a lot is folks understanding what's available and out there for families. And that, you know, that's always the struggle, right? It with, you know, you get turnover in staff. So you have staff who've been around, they know all the programs, they have relationships, so they're able to make these connections. And so part of the question is, how do you know, when you have individuals seeing individual families, how do you ensure that there is, you know, knowledge about what's available for families? And where we've seen that be more successful in our demonstration sites is when we have both self-sufficiency and child welfare there. We also see more uptake from families in, you know, supportive services when self-sufficiency offers those or says, hey, have you thought about doing this? Because when child welfare says, hey, have you thought about doing this? It's either perceived as like, oh, I better do that, or something's going to happen, or, oh, you're telling me to do that? No, thank you. Because somehow you're going to be watching me while I do that, right? So we've seen that partnership has been helpful in getting more uptake as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Meg, and then Kate.
I'm curious on looking at this slide also, like how does like primary care, behavioral health, you know, fit into this promotion?
How would it, like,
preservation? Yeah, I'm just wondering, I mean, I just coming from that world, I see that,
Mhm.
that like primary care is critical to prevention. In terms of the whole ecosystem.
Yeah, and I think it's really when we look at, I mean, let me flip back here one. I think that might be helpful. Yeah, when we're looking at prevention in terms of like universal, right? Like what is proactively promoting wellness for all families? And you know, there's examples like libraries, right? Or like you're talking about kind of those health services that are available to all. And then looking at as we move sort of more up in this arch, that it starts to being more specific, right? And what people qualify for then as we move around toward preservation and certainly intervention. So yeah, I mean, it's not an exhaustive list by any means, but I think part of what we were trying to do with this visual, and some of you may have been part of some of the Family First meetings. I know Dr. Brown, you were there when we kind of talked through this visual with a lot of folks, because part of the hope is, could there be across systems this kind of aligned understanding of when we're talking about prevention and we're talking about what is universal prevention and specific, and as folks are moving, and it certainly isn't a one direction for families. They can circle back through and do this, but really understanding where we all fall on this continuum and how so say primary care could be seen as a child welfare prevention, like preventing child welfare involvement, and being able to make those connections both for like folks who may fund work. So could child welfare take some of their funding resources and say, we want to put it over here into this, fund this parent cafe in a school? And people will be like, what? Why is child welfare funding? So making those connections between this is prevention, just like you always say, like the first, 5 years of a child's life, that's prevention, right? If we can get in there. And so how do we support each other and use our resource, we don't want to use our child welfare people by any means. We want them to stay way over here. But how do we look at funding? And so that's part of what the family preservation work is looking at as well. I just was in a conversation with a district manager yesterday for one of the child welfare branches who was trying to think through funding use and how they could be allowed to use some funding, and really pushing folks to think what's already working in your community. But you hear families all the time say, well, that would be great if only this, and this. Or a provider would say, wow, we could serve families in the best way possible if only. So let's try using some funding for that and test that if only, because if we can prove that that works, then we can really move forward with solidifying funding for it. Kate, I think I see your hand up.
Yeah, can you go to the next slide, Jennifer?
Forward?
Yeah,
This
the
one?
one that has that one.
Yeah.
So, in part of trying to bring in all the home visiting that's out there, we've spent some time getting to know Heidi Beaubriand. Where is her program? Because she has a nurse home visiting program for families that are being assessed. Is that
Yep.
right? Okay.
Yeah. So Heidi's program would really start, technically it would start it could be in the resource link, like there's been a call to the hotline.
Yeah.
Right. So we would need that call in to then be, basically if we're really at the end of the day talking about civil rights, right? We need a call to the hotline before you want anybody from child welfare walking in with you. So her program would start around this area, certainly in home. I think there was, during assessment, right, one of the things is referring to early intervention and, all these different things. And her nurses can come in and do some work with families then.
Yeah.
We are struggling a little bit with that because again, it's attached to child welfare.
Right.
And so when you have something that is firmly attached to child welfare, but you're using words like voluntary or you don't have to do it, that's a really hard, that's hard to not have families feel like they need to do it or that they don't want to do it. So there's a little bit of a struggle there. I think
Yeah.
on the reunification end is where Heidi's folks have been like super impactful when kids are returning home and being able to work with families around those kind of health related needs and well-being needs. We've seen some real impact there because families are sort of on the other end.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of getting back to Gwen's question about home visiting throughout this continuum of care, you know, and really kind of making sure that they're plugged in, because I agree with you that, you know, the program she's got, it's hard because it is voluntary, but then on the back end, how important working with families in the home setting and how powerful that is part of what this this committee is really trying to support and coordinate. So I just don't want to lose sight of that we do have home visiting throughout this continuum as well. So
yes. And I would say too, when we're looking at the in-home work, that's huge there as well. When we look at the data around the families that we're serving in family preservation, a majority of them are 0 to 4. We are seeing about, you know, creeping up is that 4 to about 12 age group that is expanding. I think part of that is folks' comfort with more complex families and being up and working in home with them. So as our skills increase and our resources increase, folks are more comfortable putting in-home safety plans in place with more complex families. But so it's a little bit of both, but yes, I mean, that's when we're trying to say, what would it take to keep this family together while we're working on whatever, you know, issues are presenting themselves. I mean, that's anything that is not, you know, that is perceived or actually outside of child welfare has been, you know, is hugely impactful for families, and things that can stay after child welfare is gone. And we're seeing in Family Pres the average length that child welfare is involved from the start of the assessment to the close of the case is about 7.5 months.
Robin, did you have one more question? And then we are going to have to wrap up, I'm afraid.
Yeah, that's why I took my hand down. But the comment I was thinking about is the home visiting coordination that we've been supporting in Douglas Klamath Lake has a community uplift closed loop referral. I see, Jennifer, that you're aware of it. And one of the things that we noticed the data has started to skew to is the pregnancy resource centers in both Douglas and Klamath are where the majority of the calls were coming in. And those are families who are walking into these pregnancy centers and they have their own feeling about them. I have my own feeling about them, but that's where a family might go that isn't being seen by a doctor and they're pregnant and they may also need, and those would be referred to home visiting and other services. But the bridge that needs to be built is how do they circle to our ODHS local partners, which they have partnerships with, and potentially unlock this connection point earlier, since a lot of our families experience child welfare when the baby's born in the hospital and there's substance use. So anyway, I was just thinking about a possible bridge there that we could be thinking about in terms of home visiting coordination and this work locally.
Yeah, and I would think self-sufficiency would be a really excellent connection for families. I mean, you know, child welfare would say there's not a child yet. Yeah, so we can't do anything with that, but self-sufficiency for sure.
And I think we're in a meeting coming up here, so maybe we can dig into it a little more.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This was a great conversation, a great opportunity to hear from two, I think, key partners for home visiting work and some opportunities there for deeper engagement with the systems as we are moving forward. I wanted to wrap us up and again, thank our three presenters today. Thanks to Children's Institute, Dana and Kali, and to Peg and to Jennifer. And thanks, Dr. Brown, for getting Jennifer here. That was really very informative, I know, for me. A couple of things in closing. First of all, take this information with you, take it back, share our website with your partners, talk up the idea of connecting more deeply within your partners and in your spheres of influence around home visiting, and making sure that those programs are at the table and involved with all these different pieces of work that's happening. So take that back with you. A couple of things to look at that'll be coming up from the COVES team as we move towards the fall are our program information resource matrix. And again, hearing more opportunities out there for places where we might need to feed that kind of information. We're already in contact with Help Me Grow, but other places like the coordination hubs that are in the Doris Duke pilots are something that are on my radar now. So that's coming from us, as well as we are going to be working hard on some family leadership recommendations for state level home visiting. That was a priority area for us, and we're learning more about how different ways to do that. So that's something that when we meet in September, hopefully we'll have some recommendations for you all to weigh in on, as well as our next version of the coordination opportunity maps. So that's going to be happening over the summer for us. We'll continue to communicate with you all via email, and of course, check our website, get on our we're going to have an Instagram feed, which, for me, that's a joke, but I know some of you have Instagram. We'll be using it. And exciting announcement for our fall meeting. Our current meeting is scheduled in September. That meeting has been canceled, but it's being replaced by an in-person meeting in October. We're going to meet in Salem. I believe, Rebecca, we've confirmed the date is October 3rd. So you'll be getting a hold of the date imminently. We're going to call it a summit, and we're bringing together all of our advisory groups. So we'll have you all here in person, we'll have our steering team in person, and our home visiting collaborative group in person for really some time to dig in and do shared work together with that kind of energy that I think we only get when we are face to face and having the opportunity to break bread together and get to know each other and really dig into the work. So we're excited to announce that and make that happen. Yeah. All right. Well, with that, Peg, you want to bring us home? Just thank everyone.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. I particularly want to thank the presenters, because you guys put a lot of time and effort into that, and it was really a robust conversation. So thanks a lot.
All right. We'll see you soon. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
Bye,
you
everyone.
all.